In today's video, I'm going to review the Spigarelli Spigua Z.T arrow rest. For those of you that are new here, my name is Kaminski. I'm a two-time Olympic silver medalist in the sport of archery, and we're going to make this channel a great resource to all types of archery. So if you haven't yet, hit that subscription button and the notification bell. That way you're notified every time a new video is uploaded. I'd appreciate it. So I apologize if I pronounced Spiga wrong or whatever. The ZT arrow rest or the sniper or whatever, I don't even know. There's so many names out there floating around. Pretty sure this is the Spiga Z.T, the micro adjustable arrow rest that is great for barebow shooters. So in today's video, I'm going to give a honest review of what I think of this rest, and I'm going to show you my findings and tell you about my findings that I've already experienced while I was attempting to tune this Gilo GT riser with the Gilo limbs. So keep an eye out for me attempting to tune this for a 30-meter crawl with at 30 meters. I actually found out some pretty nice things, and I'd like to share that with you. That'll be coming out in a later video. But in this video, we're going to be focusing on just this Spigarelli Z.T arrow rest. When I first took it out of the box, everything was as expected. There's nothing too fancy, nothing unexpected to be seen inside of the package itself. It's just a regular blister pack with some Allen wrenches, which is nice to see because you've got metric and standard sizes and threads on this. Comes with a 5/16 24 bolt, so you can bolt it to your bow as well. And then some instructions, including an exploded parts view, which is actually very nice to see. Not many manufacturers show you an exploded parts view. So in case you take things apart and you don't know how to put it back together, you can at least reference this chart. Looks like there's instructions in both Italian and English. Their manual has a little bit to be desired. The actual text on it is hard to read in some areas down here towards the right because they've copied copies many times, and the quality is degraded to the point of where it's almost ineligible. And yeah, it's a little difficult to decipher and read through, to be honest, especially because I've never put my hands on this rest. I wanted to make sure I was adjusting it correctly and not breaking it. Anyway, one of my patrons was kind enough to send me this rest, and so I could review it. It was brand new and unopened, and I wanted to make sure I didn't mess it up. So, you know, installing it, nothing fancy, nothing different, nothing difficult. All good to go. It lines up just fine. You know, it looks good. The anodizing's good. There's nice markings, and I'll show close-ups on all this stuff. There's nice markings on the actual rest itself, so you can reference your vertical as well as your horizontal settings, at least where the bracket is as far as in and out goes. The adjustability of ZT is zero tolerance, so that means that there's no slop in this rest vertically, and you can adjust these two screws here to essentially clamp down on the wire itself and give you a bit more consistency, I guess. And yeah, so it is nice to see, and it looks good. Like, I don't see anything necessarily wrong with it. So I'm going to show you close-ups now and then do talking while I'm explaining to you things, so that way you can see exactly what I'm talking about, because there are a lot of little small details on this rest that I don't want you to miss out on. Okay, so like I said, here is the actual arrow rest. It looks pretty good, pretty standard, nothing very unexpected. It does have these nice micro adjustable knobs. This is your vertical adjust, this is your horizontal adjust. These were the two screws here and here that adjust the tension that essentially clamps down on the vertical part of this wire. So that way you have no play, vertical play up and down like this, as far as the rest itself is concerned. So that's really nice to see. I think that's a really cool feature to remove the play. I'm a big fan of that. I think it's great. And if you can see here, those are your adjustments. Those are your indicators for left to right. There are some over here for up and down. I'll show you that once I take the rest off. So the good things that I have seen about this rest that I really like, I like that it's micro adjustable. I think that is excellent. I think the markings left to right are good and really nice to see. However, there are a few things that I have noticed that is a bit of an issue, and we'll be going over that. So the way that I adjusted and set this up is like this. I'll show you from this angle. See if I can get the string out of the way. I have it set up to where I can move. I moved this block as far as I can towards the inside because I wanted to have more clearance here to the arrow. As you can see, it's inside the shelf. But where it first came, it was very far this way. It was centered in the block assembly, and I couldn't push this in any further than here. And this position and these things here were actually going to almost contact the arrow as it was going by. So the first thing I did is I slid the block as far as I could that direction, and then I just adjusted this out setting with this screw here and moved the arm out enough for an arrow to sit on. The rest itself is nice and stout as expected and is great for barebow shooters. There is a bit of a hook on the end of the tip here to help hold the arrow on the rest. Personally, if I was going to shoot it in this setting where the rest would want to stay out, I would cut off that bend so that way my arrow doesn't have to ramp up and over that bend as it goes by every single time. I find a bit more consistent grouping that way. Some things that you know, I'm not a giant fan of is the actual adjustment, and I will show you why. If I loosen this, this is the locking screw for the left to right adjustment. As I screw it, it's actually really difficult to turn, especially counterclockwise. I have crazy grip strength, and I have a hard time tuning this, or spinning this. This is actually fairly uncomfortable for me to turn. So if people that are watching this video don't really have much of grip strength like I do, you will need to use pliers on this to adjust it. You could adjust the preload on it, I suppose, that holds it in place, but I just not a giant fan of that. That is nitpicking. Also, the adjustment and the markings and indicators here, you can see as I scroll it over, I'm completely covering up the laser etched marks that are right here, even though this pointer sits up so high. So if I was Spigarelli, I would have moved these lasers all the way up to the flat surface and maybe even had them on the top as well, just so you can actually see the indications, especially the half marks, a little bit easier. Now, another thing that I don't like is that after I am done tightening this down, because of this play, if you see that play right there, I'll pull the rest down and tighten it, and it stays in this lower location. Now, you can see the pitch in this block. It stays that way. Now, if I loosen this and push it up and tighten it, it doesn't center anywhere. There's no V-block assembly. There's nothing that is keeping this block from rotating this way. And so if you need to make a micro adjust left to right, say if I need to move it in slightly or whatever, I'll move that, crank it to adjust it in, which the left and right is much easier to move than the up and down, and I tighten it. If I'm not careful, I could be slightly off vertically. So I don't really like that. Same thing goes for the vertical adjustment. I can loosen that up and attempt to turn it. Oh god, it's so hard. It is so difficult to move the vertical adjustment, especially because of its proximity to the actual bow itself. And this is plenty loose, and I physically, it's so difficult to move. It's not fun. The vertical is almost impossible. I have a hard time doing it. I'm not a fan of that. But also, in the vertical, there's play too, like that. So when you're making your adjustments and you're for consistency, what you could do is, okay, every time I tighten it down, I'm going to push down on the rest, or I'm going to twist this block one direction, hold it in place as I snug it, and that's how I'm going to adjust it. And that's okay, that's reasonable. You can do that, that's totally fine. I just don't like that I have to. I think it'd be much more consistent if somewhere inside this assembly they had a V block and a receiver of the V block, so that way when you tightened it down, it would essentially always center itself like this. Right now it's just flat on flat, and you can do this, but if there was a ridge in there, you couldn't misalign it, or at least misalign it nearly as much. So there's that to consider. And then also, like I said, I don't like the hook. The hook's a lot for me, but that is what it is. So there's one more thing that I don't like about this rest. And the reason that I even know about this is I actually shot this rest. I put it on this bow, this Closeups GT, and my knocking point was way, way, way far off. And I really needed to make a big adjustment to make it work properly. Specifically, my knocking point was too low. I needed to move it up almost a 1/4 inch more, which is a huge amount. And because of that, So what happened is, as I was raising my nocking point on this, raising my nocking point up, because where the arrow is contacting the rest vertically, and because it is so far back, and I'm going to make a mark actually where it's contacting the arrow, or the actual arrow shaft. That black mark is where the vertical support is of the arrow, essentially. It will change slightly depending on how far in or out the arrow rest is, but essentially that is where the vertical support is. And if I remove the arrow and I take the bow and I turn it completely sideways for you, you'll see that the mark to the plunger is not even remotely in the same place. The mark is so far behind the arrow, where the arrow contacts the plunger for its left to right contact, that when I adjust my nocking point height like this, the arrow is pivoting here vertically on the actual arrow rest. And so what that's doing is it's moving my arrow a lot up and down on the center of the plunger. And I noticed after I raised it about 1/4 of an inch, my arrow went from the center of my plunger tip down to the bottom third, and it was so far down that it was actually very concerning to me. So I then had to adjust my arrow rest up to compensate along with my nocking point. And because I was actually moving my nocking point up and then had to move my rest up, I then had to move my nocking point up even further and my rest up even further and so on. And there was just a lot of adjustment that I really needed to do because this black dot is not up here. The way that this rest is designed, it would be best if I had a rest, an arrow wire that kind of came out straight, and right here near the riser it made a little whoop around the riser, and then it came out at a sharper angle like this, like further this way instead of more straight. There's two ways to look at this. More straight would be less deviation of the arrow getting pushed away as it's going by because it's a smoother, flatter surface. But if you have it sticking out further like this, not necessarily further, but at a sharper angle, you could have this mark be aligned with the center of the plunger, and then when you're adjusting your nocking point, you're not changing your arrow on the location of the plunger. So that's just kind of like a nitpicking detail that I wouldn't necessarily say everybody would notice, but I didn't like it personally. Now, as far as everything else on the actual rest itself is concerned, I do like it. The fit and finish, the adjustment is nice, although it is stiff. But that means that there's not necessarily much in the way of backlash. Also, there's not a lot in the way of actual play other than what I've showed you. You can see here on the up and down adjustment that there is a lot more in the way of marks that you can see very plainly. But on this vertical block, it's almost impossible to see. And it's not because this is high, because this whole block moves as one. So it's just that they didn't bring the laser etching up far enough, in my opinion. The actual adjustment block, or the locating block, it's fine. Nothing different for it. It's got a slot here so you can have your plunger in one spot, your 5/16 24 bolt in another to lock it in place. But if you don't have a bow with 2 plunger holes, they give you this hole so you can drill and tap your riser and mount this in a permanent location as an option as well. The movement of it is actually very, very smooth. I like that feeling. It's nice and it feels like glass. I mean, it's really, really clean. Like I said, just that adjustment and the ability to have it not pivot and slop back and forth would be awesome. If this adjuster wasn't so tight, that would also be a benefit, especially for people like women and children playing with this thing and trying to adjust it. I mean, now that it's not on the bow and it's not stuck next to the riser, it's definitely not as difficult to adjust. It still is a little stiff, it still is a little tough, and I wish it was slightly different, but it is what it is. Other than that, I mean, I think this is a great rest. This is a good option to have in your quiver, or this is a good option to have in your on your bow, in your arsenal of equipment. I do like the micro adjustable ability and of both horizontal and vertical, and I like that there's no play in this wire, or at least you can adjust how much play is in this wire, because right now, after shooting it a little bit, I can feel a teeny tiny little bit of play, and you can adjust these Allen wrenches if you choose to do so. They don't recommend it, but they say you can to really take all play out. which is nice to see. I think that's a great option to have. And yeah, overall, I'm very happy with this arrow rest. One thing I did forget to mention, and it might have been due to my personal individualized setup, but this arrow rest itself, the hook, is such a steep amount and such a high amount of hook that when the arrow would go by, if I had contact as the arrow was going by, the actual rest would stick underneath the plunger, because this plunger, or this tip, was actually touching the face of my plunger itself. The hook itself would hit my plunger tip as I was trying to push it in. So I couldn't actually get the arrow rest to push in and go completely under my plunger without having to slide the rest further back. And if I slid the rest further back, that black mark would be even further behind the center line of the plunger. And I have found that what is really important to archery, all kinds of archery, compound, recurve, barebow, doesn't matter, all the same. You have to have I wouldn't necessarily know what to call it, but your points of where the arrow rotates on the bow in the same plane, or on the same axis, or in the same area. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is where the grip is and the plunger. If I'm torquing the bow left and right, that's where the plunger is, and that's where it's going to affect the arrow. If I also have the arrow rest and the plunger in the same place, when I torque the rest and the bow in any direction, it's going to influence the impact point of the arrow all the same, because it's all from the same location. But if you differentiate the two and you move the arrow rest back and you move the plunger forward, your vertical torque is going to have more or less impact on the arrow than your horizontal torque will, because they're in two different locations and two different distances from the pivot point of the grip. And the plunger point is right above the pivot point, it's centrally located, and the arrow rest is behind the pivot point. So it can potentially have an opposite effect that you would expect to see. So if I were to torque the bow down, the actual arrow is not going to go low, it's actually going to go high, because as if I have the pivot point back here below the rest, and the rest is here, if I torque the grip down, you can see the rest is raising. If I had it in front or right above the pivot point, as I torque it down, it goes lower. So I don't necessarily think that that was the best way and the best shape for this rest to be. It's going to fit all bows this way. The way that I would run this setup is I would have a totally different shaped arrow rest that really is difficult to get into position with this pivot so far behind the actual riser itself, because then you wouldn't have much room for the arrow rest to move in to give you clearance for the arrow as it was going by. It really needs to be as far forward as possible, and this entire assembly here is a little bit bulky and it pulls it back so far, so you're kind of forced to have the arrow rest be at the specific angle that it is with this type of design. So that is kind of like extreme level nitpicking of what I would like to see changed on this type of setup. But overall, like I said, I think this is a good buy. I like the micro adjustability, and I like that the actual play up and down can be minimized and completely eliminated. Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this video, consider hitting the subscription button and the notification bell, as well as the like button. I would appreciate it. Also, please consider supporting my channel. If you head to my website, jakekaminski.com, there'll be info and links on Patreon, apparel, books, and equipment sales, PayPal donate button, a P.O. box to send things to, and above all else, please share this video, because there's no better advertising than word of mouth.